Welcome to today's episode of Unthinkable, a podcast about the aftermath of incidents causing catastrophic injury or death, the experts who are called to serve when these accidents occur, and lessons that we can all learn and implement in our own personal lives. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, KyleBachus.com. Now here's the host of the Unthinkable podcast, Kyle Bachus.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us again today. We have an incredible guest with us today. Just a little background about what we do in this podcast. I'm Kyle Bachus. I'm a lawyer. I've been representing the families of victims of both of accidents and of crimes for almost, over 30 years now. And about 4 years ago, unfortunately, my own mother was the victim of a crime and was killed actually by a commercial truck, and that kind of led me to really understand from a victim's perspective. Of course, I've been representing people for many years, but then to be a victim myself of a crime and to walk through and deal with the criminal justice system along with my family from the victim side really taught me a lot. And I wanted to start this podcast to kind of give a behind the scenes look at the people who are asked to come in and to evaluate conduct, whether it's the conduct in an accident, conduct in a sexual assault, conduct in a police shooting, or other issues. I want to bring people in from behind the scenes who can give you some insight into the inner workings of our criminal justice and our civil justice system. And today, let me tell you, we have just an incredible guest, Dr. Laurence Miller. And Dr. Miller is a clinical forensic and police psychologist based out of Palm Beach County, Florida. And gosh, Doctor, I think you've written 12 books on various topics, and just super excited to have your knowledge. And I'm sure that that those listeners and watchers of this are going to be just fascinated by the work that you do. So thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy day to join us. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Kyle, for inviting me. I rarely pass up an opportunity to try to explain to people how to use science for the betterment of justice and health in ways that, the average person isn't ordinarily aware of because they don't have exposure to that knowledge and that technology.
Yeah, and I want to get into it, Doctor, but can you give us, the listeners, just some background as to how you got into the field that you're so well known for now, and just what moved you to get into this space? Can you tell us about your history?
Well, it's kind of a winding road, so I'm going to try to bullet point it for you. My background is actually in neuroscience and neuropsychology, which is a study of brain and behavior. And professionally, I started out by doing neuropsychological evaluations. And these are evaluations of people with brain syndromes ranging from little kids with learning disabilities and ADHD all the way up to seniors who may be experiencing cognitive impairment and pretty much anything in between. And some of those individuals that began doing evaluations on were individuals who were involved in accidents, assaults, where there was some question of brain injury or cognitive impairment that may have been due to a physical assault or an accident. And my job there was to try to document what the damages were and make recommendations for treatment. At the same time, working in the legal system in the civil area led me into doing criminal evaluation for things like civil competencies, competency to proceed, competency to stand trial, mental state at time of offense, which is often interpreted as the insanity defense. And that sort of led me, the next jump was working with police officers directly in terms of various aspects of police psychology, from doing stress debriefings to for officers that had been involved in officer-involved shootings, deadly force encounters, to eventually testifying in high-profile deadly force cases where a police officer may be accused of or even charged with a crime for using deadly force when, in fact, the reason for that may be far more subtle and far more nuanced. And that's something that a jury would have to understand in order to make their determination.
And so when did you write your first book?
My first book had nothing to do with the law, actually. My first book had to do with basically trying to explain certain aspects of personality and psychopathology in neuropsychological terms. And that was in I believe, 1990. That
Wow.
was a book called Inner Natures. I'd always been fascinated by the correspondence of sort of mind and brain, which people think is sort of two separate domains, but really, if you think about it, how can you think if your brain isn't working? So I've always been a lifelong learner, fascinated by how the brain works, and part of my writing is sort of an expression of the joy and excitement I get from teaching. So assimilating knowledge, acquiring it, and then passing it on to others is something that I feel gifted to be able to do.
Wow, that's incredible. And what's your most recent publication?
Well, the most recent book came out. It came out just as COVID was hitting,
Hmm.
which was the Psychology of Police Deadly Force Encounters, which is really a kind of neuroscience, psychological explanation for what actually goes into the minute processes of decision making when an officer is faced with that decision to pull the trigger. What are some of the brain mechanisms involved? What are some of the social factors? Some of the cultural factors, ethnic factors, that go into that split second decision as to take a life or not.
Okay, well, what's one of the things that's really interesting about your most recent publication that I think uh, it really impacts what we do on this podcast is, you know, we try to provide some life hacks so that people understand what might be going on behind the scenes. And there's nothing more behind the scenes than the minds of a investigating police officer who is called upon to do their work. And sometimes those interactions can escalate. But if you were to try to explain as you do through your work, I guess first of all we should define what excessive force is. But then I'm very interested to learn from you about uh, the inner workings of kind of the psychology behind why some police officers might be engaging in excessive force and others never have that come upon them, even in similar situations. So can you tell us a little bit first about what is excessive force and then how
Well,
that interplays with the psychological background?
yeah, I'm glad we're starting with that because that's usually the foundation of everything we're going to talk about. There's often people often conflate deadly force with excessive force, but they're actually two different things because excessive force is defined both logically and legally as any force that is more than what is needed to create a safety in a situation. And the level of force often interacts with how justified the force is, but it's a separate dimension. So, for example, if a police officer comes upon someone committing an arrestable offense and says, "Sir, you're under arrest. Please put your hands behind your back," and the person complies and sits down, and let's say prior to that there was a couple of words exchanged, and the officer is a little bit ticked off, and just to show the guy that you can't mess with me, he gives him a little head flick like this, right? Nothing, right? That's excessive force.
Mm.
um, or simply pokes him. It's like that's excessive force because it was not necessary. Okay. Now let's go to scenario number two. These are the extremes. Someone is holding a weapon. It might be a firearm, or it might be some bladed weapon, or it might be a hammer from someone's tool shed, and he's threatening an officer or another citizen, and the officer says, "Drop the weapon, drop the weapon, drop the weapon," and this 280-pound, 6'6" linebacker starts running at the police officer, raising the weapon about to strike him. The officer fires, empties his gun into the citizen that's racing towards him. Because the rule about deadly force is you do not use deadly force unless it's absolutely necessary. But if it is necessary, the concept is deadly force. Now, why is that? Because you watch TV shows, you listen to news reports. People often ask, well meaningly, because they don't understand, well, did you have to actually fire so many bullets? Couldn't you wound him? Why don't you just fire one or two? The purpose of deadly force is actually not to wound someone. It's not even to kill someone. It's to stop them.
Mm.
And if you fire one or two rounds, and they strike the subject, and the subject does die several seconds after being struck, but not before he has bashed your head in with that hammer, then that is a scenario that has happened many times. And that's why if you're going to use deadly force, then the decision is that it be deadly. So most of the disputes over the use of deadly force don't come with the actual amount of force used, but whether or not it was justified. Now, most excessive force cases, the ones that don't make the news because they're far more common, are ones that don't involve someone being killed. They're not headline worthy. They're usually not newsworthy. They may not have some, exciting racial angle to it, but those are the ones that are more commonly investigated because those are the ones where a citizen feels they've been disrespected, they've been abused, they've been treated roughly or unfairly, and that's still excessive force. So again, excessive force means anything that is not required to save a life or preserve safety for an officer or a citizen. And deadly force is one type of force that, in most cases, when used by police officers, is not excessive, is justified. Of all of the deadly force encounters that occur in, let's take the United States, a tiny, minuscule proportion of them are even investigated. A far smaller proportion of them are found to be not justified, which is good because if that were not the case, then we'd all be in trouble.
Yeah, fascinating. So going back to excessive force, meaning as you've described it, an unreasonable level of force under the totality of the circumstances. Is that about it? I mean, that's
Well, I
that's what.
think Well, no, you've done your homework because you're sort of citing the Supreme Court case, which is Graham v. Connor back in the 1980s, that said that use of force, even deadly force, is justified if, in the estimation of a reasonable officer at the scene, the subject posed an imminent threat to life. And that does leave a certain amount of discretion to the police officer, which you might say, well, oh, good, that's great, but not so fast, because what that means is that also leaves a lot of room for doubt and other interpretations, usually involving post hoc analyses like body cam recordings, witness statements that may have seen little snippets of what went on from different perspectives, but have not gotten into, as you mentioned before, the totality of what goes on inside the mind of that officer who fired.
Well, when you think about it from uh, the perspective of whether it's an accident or whether it is an officer having to make a judgment call in a short window of time, so much transpires in such a small amount of time, right? That decision making leading up to an accident, the decision making leading up to an excessive force uh, case or no case, let's say, um, we're really talking about uh, decisions that have to be made, man, in a matter of seconds. And that then leads to, well, who is the person making those decisions, and what information, whether it's a commercial truck driver or professional police officer, their knowledge, skill, and training leading up to that moment seems to be crucial in terms of what's reasonable or unreasonable in terms of their actions. How
Well,
does that interplay, affect police conduct?
there's a point you brought up earlier, which I think is also important. There's we like to divide things into twos, even though things are rarely either or. But there's an old saying that there are only two types of people in the world: those that divide the world into two types of people and those who don't. But two extremes when these scenarios evolve. One is the what's called the slow buildup. You have an officer approaches a subject. Um, they're doing something wrong. Maybe it's just a traffic stop. Maybe one of the reasons sometimes people wonder, I saw somebody pulled over at the side of the road. Why are there 3 or 4 police vehicles parked behind them? What's going on? Why do you need, 8 cops to give some guy a ticket? Well, the reason is they ran the plates. And guess what? There's a warrant out for that person's arrest. Maybe the car is stolen. But whatever the reason is, somebody is committing a robbery. There's a crime in progress. And the officer tries to intervene. Drop the weapon, put your hand behind your back, and there's a slow buildup. Now, most citizens understand that if you have a bunch of cops and they're telling you to do something, just do it. You can have your day in court later if you feel you were unfairly treated. And the reason is because police officers are very sensitive to safety. both the public safety and their own safety. And every cop knows that there are circumstances where things started out nice and slow, and something happened, and there was a little bit of a verbal dance, and somebody said one thing and somebody said something else. And before you know it, an elbow goes here and a foot goes there. There may be a grappling circumstance. And at some point, if the officer feels that there is an imminent threat of death or serious injury, the officer makes that decision to use deadly force. So that's scenario number one. Less commonly, but it does happen, there is a violent crime in progress. Somebody jumps out of a grocery store or a bank and they're firing as they run. Then you don't have, there is no buildup. There is no time to think of what to do. Those cases, the latter type, are actually usually easier to justify because in that case, the danger was clear from the get go, and almost anybody can understand why a police officer would fire. So usually what leads to an investigation where an officer may be suspected of wrongly using force, deadly or otherwise, is where the premise of why it happened begins. So these are the cases you hear about where, how come that guy was shot because he had expired tags on his license? How come that guy was shot because he was selling loose cigarettes? How come that, and on and on. And that's what the public hears. Well, no, they weren't shot for a license tag. They weren't shot for selling cigarettes. They were shot because whatever happened in that exchange from the time they were confronted by the police officer, um, the evolution of what took place ended up with that person creating in the minds of those police officers a deadly threat, which of course leads to another point you made earlier. What types of officers are more likely to be involved in these types of scenarios? We know that in any profession, whether it's law, policing, airline pilots, medicine, that the proficiency, the skill with which the professional discharges their responsibility is going to be a bell curve. Most people in the middle of that curve do a workmanlike job. They do their job competently. You know, they neither excel nor are they deficient. And then there are some people at one end of the curve that are really great. They seem to be natural for it. People respect them. They deserve the props they get because they do a more than adequate job. They're excellent. But there's always going to be a couple of people on the tail end of that curve who are going to do a less than admirable job. So, yes, there are some police officers who may, by virtue of problems with training, by disposition, more likely to be biased towards perceiving a danger than others. Once again, I have to emphasize no cop, just for expediency purposes, is going to just gratuitously shoot someone to get revenge or because they were insulted or because there are any of the reasons that people sometimes think that cops are out there to do. Remember, in criminal law, cops are not there to dispense justice. They're there to detain people so that justice can be dispensed by the court. So their job is to do whatever they need to do to keep someone in custody so that the courts can do their work. And most of them do that.
Well,
And,
you
you know,
know, what's fascinating about it is that we all interact with people, friends, family, people we don't know, strangers, who all go about their business from maybe a different, uh, you know, different psychological starting point, right? Some people are more prone to be confrontational. Some are more prone to shy away from confrontation. And so police officers are no different, right? They're members of our families, communities. They're out there trying to do a job, but they are confronted with situations that, in their mind, might make them believe that there is a threat to their life or well-being, whereas maybe other people perceive it and can de-escalate. So, what is it? What have you found in your studies to be some of the, I guess, the characteristics, whether it's cultural, educational, that make some officers more prone to using force than others under maybe the same circumstances?
so the reason you and I are sitting here after millions of years of evolution is that organisms in general, and humans in particular, have evolved to be risk averse. That is, we are more likely to err on the side of caution because in the natural world in which we evolved, and even in today's complex social world, we are more likely to benefit from being a little overcautious and perhaps overestimating a risk that doesn't exist than to be too naive and exposing ourselves to a risk and getting killed as a result. So we are not resolved. We are not evolved from those people who are too trusting. Okay, we're evolved from people who are a little skeptical, a little cynical, but not so much that you don't trust anyone. So use that as a baseline. And now you have police officers who are screened to some degree. I mean, the thing about becoming a police officer is one of the things they have to go through is a psychological evaluation. It's not a very detailed one. It's basically kind of a rough net, but it does screen out things like major psychopathology, overuse of aggression. But even so, you're going to have some officers who may be a little bit more assertive and aggressive. The problem is, if somebody is just going out there and behaving badly, they're not going to last long in any job, much less a very interpersonally sensitive job like policing. But typically, it's here we go with the law of twos again. The officer who may be a little bit overzealous, let's say, also is the kind of officer who may be a little bit braver. They may be the officer who goes in there and is the first in during a drug bust. They may be the officer who does their job in a very assertive way and makes the arrests and isn't afraid to go in there and do things that other cops might hold back on. The problem is, at what point does that become excessive? There is a whole field of study. What personality characteristics go into officers that do seem to overuse force. Most of the cases that I've been involved in, and in most of the trainings that I've been involved in, and let's just limit it to what we call contested use of force cases. That is, cases where there is some question, either they're being investigated by internal affairs, or in fact, the act was seen as so egregious that there have been criminal charges that have been filed. Most of those cases involve what you described earlier as that split-second syndrome. But when there is another element, like I said before, the predicate, if witnesses at the scene or body cam footage says, you know what, that officer didn't have to provoke that person. Okay, yeah, the citizen acted like a jerk, but come on, it's the cop's job to be the grown-up in the room. When that happens, that's usually when you go back and you look at that officer's history, this is not the first time they've had a contentious interaction with a citizen. All right, now look, I'm sitting here talking about police officers. I work with them. I respect almost all of them, but we have to deal with reality. And if you have someone who, for whatever reason, is not temperamentally fit in a tense interpersonal situation, the first line of defense is training. Just because you're not natural at something, you can train. And in fact, that's one of the big fields now in policing is de-escalation training, dealing with mentally ill citizens, because what training does is establish a baseline. What it says is this is what you can do in a situation. You don't have to like somebody, but this is as far as you can go and no further. And it gives you skills to deal with someone that don't involve force. A lot of cops that I've talked to have been very skeptical about, interpersonal training, de-escalation. They have a sort of tough guy attitude. Hey, I'm not some social worker. I don't get paid to talk to people. Once they've taken the training and they've actually been in situations where they see what it can do, most of them become a believer. Because remember, the way you sell it to people is the goal of this training is not to turn you into a namby-pamby social worker. The goal of de-escalation training is to keep you safe, right? If you can do something that will make some suspect, maybe they're mentally ill, maybe they're intoxicated, maybe they don't know what they're doing, or maybe they're just mean. But if you can do something to keep them from attacking you and provoking you, doesn't that make you a safer person? So the best way to maintain a psychologically stable pool of officers is not so much the screening out aspect, but the screening in. Identify the qualities that we know make people successful at policing, and then select individuals to do that. The practical problem, is like in other professions such as nursing and so on, when you have a shortage of personnel, what typically happens is the recruitment criteria become somewhat more relaxed. Now, we understand we need nurses, we need police officers, we need airline pilots. We read the news, but these are, three examples of professions where the average public doesn't want to believe people are compromising on quality. It's like, hello, these are three professions where our lives are in your hands, and we have to believe that you're going to take care of us. One of the reasons that you hear these bad cop stories where it really freaks people out. If you think about it, because I mentioned it just a moment ago. The other profession that the public likes to lap up scandal stories are bad doctors, doctors selling fentanyl, doctors, unqualified doctors performing
Sure.
surgeries. Why? Why doctors and cops? You know why? Because these are the people that we depend on for our lives. We depend on the cops to preserve our lives. We depend on the doctors to save our lives. And we want to believe, we have to believe that these people are going to do the best for us. Because, and when they don't, if they take that authority and abuse it to the point where not just not helping us, but harming us, then we have no mercy. We come down on them
Well, I
with a
tell you,
ton of
I
glory.
mean, to the staffing point, it sure seems like, I'm here in Denver, Colorado, and it sure seems on the roads there's a lot fewer cops out there. It's almost like they're now, instead of that they're more reactive rather than proactive in terms of law enforcement, in terms of because there's not enough people who are willing to risk their own lives to do that job these days. And so I could see how that certainly staffing could have a huge impact. And you're right, we do. We rely upon them for safety every day. And I work with police officers all the time, and love them. But there are, like in all industries, there are some bad actors. The interesting thing, Dr. Miller, from a psychological perspective, is is it possible? And this is my, I guess, my question to you: is it possible to preemptively identify, or there are ways or characteristics to preemptively identify and to weed out prospective bad actors, especially when there is a shortage of people even applying for the job? How do you do that? How do we? Is that possible to psychologically?
Police agencies are already doing it. It's just that you can't do it perfectly. Just like with bad doctors and bad anything else. The first step is the pre-employment psychological screening, and again, that's sort of a rough net. It'll weed out major psychopathology. Somebody who is severely depressed or psychotic is not likely to get through the net to become a police officer. But most of the problems of let's just call them the small, tiny percentage of bad cops is not people who are crazy. They're just people who have a personality orientation that makes them particularly narcissistic or exploitive or on a power trip. And those are the ones that sometimes are hard to spot until they're already embedded in the community. But but again, when you look at some of these cases that have been contested and you look at some of the histories, not all, perhaps not even most, but in many cases there is a kind of paper trail. Because one of the things, when you know this as an attorney, when you are handling a case, you review piles and piles and piles of records, right? And one of the things
Yes.
we review is a work history. So if you have an officer that's had, more than the usual disciplinary acts, maybe none of them were anything, terrible, maybe some with disrespect or things that any one of which might not be a big deal. You've had officers who have been disciplinary problems within their own agencies. Within a police agency, most of the cops know who to stay away from. Oh, you're not going out with Joe. So but the problem is no one of those particular incidents is enough to discipline somebody out of the department. They'll go for training. They'll go for what's called progressive discipline, because it's expensive to retain and hire a police officer, like a doctor, like a nurse. And so what happens? Okay, well we'll do the paperwork. We'll let it slide this time until something happens. And I don't personally, and I don't think anybody has an answer like what's the threshold. But if you are a supervisor or a manager of any business, and let's face it, policing, like anything else, it's still an organization. If you see a particular problem with a particular employee, whether it's simply underperformance, most police misconduct doesn't have anything to do with excessive force. It has to do things like sleeping on duty. In fact, most of the times when officers are cited for misbehavior, it's underperformance. They're not doing enough. You're not out there making enough arrests. But whatever the problem is, if you can create a fair and credible disciplinary procedure. By discipline, we're not talking about whips. We're talking about constructively explaining what the officer did wrong, what the right way to do it is, and then observing and monitoring the progress. It's not going to solve everything, but it will. It will at least make the people who are in the department feel like they're being handled fairly, that they're not, being. As I'm sure you've heard this. they're coming down on us because of political reasons. Sometimes that's just cops complaining, but a lot of times there's a kernel of truth to that. So yeah, I think you're right. Cops have taken a beating over the last couple of decades. Very tiny proportion of which may be deserved, but most of the time they're just getting tarred with the same brush, um, and they really are out there trying to do their jobs. You want us to protect you, but yet if we look at you the wrong way, you file a complaint. And you know
Right.
what? Most cops, even under those circumstances, accept that. And in fact, another irony is when you ask cops what are the most stressful parts of your job, what do you think they say? Most people think they say, being shot at, the long hours. No, they say, we're out there. We deal with our job is to deal with the people, those elements of the public that most people don't want to deal with. We get that, say most of them. We get that someone's going to spit at us, curse at us. You know what? For the most part, we suck it up because that's part of our job. What we can tolerate is the people in our own agency who are supposed to have our back, who then turn around and bow to other pressures and treat us unfairly for what we've done.
Yeah.
And again, that's not the norm. That's not that's the exception. And I know a lot of police managers that I've worked with that have great reputations. That the rank and file say this guy, this gal is great. They have our back. But when you do, and if you do that, what that means is when somebody really does something wrong, your credibility in citing them for it is going to be much more enhanced.
Well, I liked your description of the bell curve, whether it's with police officers or doctors or lawyers or whomever, the kind of the bell curve. And that is, um, it's something that when I talk to families in regarding the police investigation into an incident, and I explain it's a bit of a lottery, right? Because it depends upon what jurisdiction and who's not on vacation and whose shift it is and who's assigned to cover your particular event, and that's because there's this bell curve. Maybe you get the best, accident reconstructionist on the force, or maybe you get the worst one, and so you don't know. And I think it plays a very important part in in interactions with police officers in general. So we like to again use some life hack stuff here, right? If you consider going into an interaction with a police officer that there's this bell curve, and that police officer doesn't know you and you don't know them, if you're in a situation where you have to interact and you don't know where they fall on the bell curve, you can presume that they're somewhere in the middle, which is where most people are. But what are the life hacks that you would suggest to those in the public who are interacting with police officers, whether they are innocent or guilty or a witness? What's your suggestions on how to make sure that those interactions go well?
All right, I'm glad you asked that because in my college police psychology class, I do this as an opening for the class. So let's take the most common type of circumstance where a citizen is likely to encounter a police officer. Most citizens go through their whole life and never interact with a police officer. But when you do, what's the most common scenario? A traffic stop.
Yeah.
All right. So it's simple, and there are actually courses that are given to the public. First thing is, if you see those blue lights, stop the car, because if they have to chase you right away, let's assume a police officer who's in that modal position, right on the mean, neither naive nor particularly aggressive, just wants to do their job. You ran a red light, you rolled a stop sign, you may not think it's a big deal. If you see those blue lights, stop the car. When you stop the car, stay in the vehicle unless the officer tells you to come out of the vehicle. Roll your window down so they can talk to you. Don't say anything. You are allowed to say, "Officer, why did you pull me over?" Sometimes they'll say, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Get the answer. Respond as if you were talking to somebody that you met, sitting in an airport waiting for a plane. You're not their friend. You're not their enemy. You're having a civil tone, a civil conversation. Um, Police officers and most of the public don't realize two things. Police officers are the only non-military force that are mandated to be able to use deadly force when they have to. That's the first thing. But even less well known is that A police officer has the right to tell you to do something as long as it's a lawful command and a citizen has to obey. They don't have to be under arrest, they don't have to be under investigation. So if you're standing on the street corner and a police officer says, "Sir, I need you to move across the street," and your impulse is say, "You can't tell me what to do." Au contraire, yes, it's right there in the code. You must obey a lawful criminal act. If the police officer tells you to go hold up the 7-Eleven, then no, you don't have to obey because that's not lawful. So let's get back to sitting in your car. If most police officers will ask you, they may ask you, do you have weapons in the car? Depending, you're in Colorado, I'm in Florida. That's likely to be a common question that's going to be asked. If you do, and if you do, whether or not you are authorized to have that weapon, you're better off saying yes and showing it to them and saying it's in my console. In which case, the police officer will say, "Step out of the car." They may want to search you. Now, remember, they don't know who you are. They may have gotten a description of a car that matches yours that was running weapons, running drugs, human trafficking, gang related. So if they think that you could be one of those suspects, they're not being gruff with you because they dislike you. They're trying to be safety. They're not searching you because they're profiling you or for any other reason. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but in most cases, they're doing it because they're concerned with safety. All right. Do you have anything on you that could hurt me? In some cases, they may even, if it's really a suspicious circumstance, they may even handcuff you. Now, that's not likely to happen in most traffic stops, but if they do, the important thing to realize is, again, we're talking about that modal bell curve officer. If they're going to that length, they feel that for whatever reason, whatever incoming information that they know and you don't, they're feeling unsafe. And typically, when it's all over, if everything's fine, they'll uncuff you. They'll say, "Sorry to bother you, sir," but they may even explain why they did it. But the bottom line is comply with the officer. Don't ask them, "Why are you doing this to me?" Don't complain. Don't curse them. Don't say, I know my rights." Now, a couple of scenarios, for example, if they want to search your vehicle, you don't have to let them. All right. So the question is, well, if I have nothing to hide, why shouldn't I let them search my vehicle? The only real reason for asserting those rights is they may call for backup. It could take hours and hours. You'll be standing there while they search, looking for something. So, especially if you don't have anything to hide, all you can simply say is, "Officer, I do not consent to searches." Now they can lie to you. They're allowed to lie to you. They can say, "You know what? We've had a range of gang shootings here in your car. Misa, do you have any weapons in the car? We heard that. If you don't let us search your vehicle, we're going to get the drug sniffing dogs and we're going to tear your car apart." "Sorry, officer, I don't consent to searches." So typical, what they'll do is they'll make some face-saving move. They'll give you a ticket for what they did. But again, use your judgment. Use your judgment. You're a citizen. They're a police officer. You're in there in the car. They can call as many police officers as they need. You're probably unarmed. They're very armed.
Well, and I
They,
tell
they,
you, I think you're uh, pointing out the fact that
By the way,
a
none of
police
this is something that I made up. This is all coming from standard training videos and classes that police officers themselves and attorneys who represent victims of police brutality have given to avoid this. So I didn't invent this. I didn't come up with this clever list of bullet points. This is something that I've assimilated from other authoritative sources.
no, but I think that it's important for people to hear that a police officer, even if they haven't arrested you, has the authority to ask you to uh, take lawful order from them. I mean, I think that's an important piece of information because I think there's a lot of people who just presume that you can either A, arrest me, or B, I can go whenever I want, wherever I want. And there's some gray area there about at what point you're free to go.
Well, the other thing you can ask is if it looks like the cop's getting nowhere, you can say, "Am I being detained? Am I under arrest?" And if they don't answer or say no, then don't just drive off. Just say, "Well, then if I'm not being detained, can I go?" And the answer is, yes. The other thing about if you've got your friends in the car, tell them to do one simple thing: shut the f up. Just shut up. Because any kind of disturbance is going to make that officer become more skeptical. But you can ask your friends, or what they should do if they're there is use your eyes, use your ears, observe what's going on. The other question I often get asked is, am I allowed to videotape? Can I whip my cell phone out and videotape? The answer is you are allowed to record. But if this police officer is looking for something to detain you on, if that video recording can be construed as interfering with a police action, then that itself can be an offense. So you know what? If you don't have any real reason to do so, duh. Don't you? The police officer just wants to resolve this safely and move on. You just want to get in your car and go back to work. So what are you going to do that's going to make this end as quickly as possible? That should be the bubble over your screen. What can I do that's going to end this as peacefully and as quickly as possible? And unless you have done something wrong, that's something that both you and the cop should be thinking.
Well, it's great advice and information. I think one of the things that scares people is that um, they are concerned maybe a police officer is lying to me, and they're allowed to lie. And I think um, it can impact the the credibility towards one another in a conversation that might lead to a rapid de-escalation if and so there's distrust, I guess, on both sides. The police officer wants to make it home safely at night, and the person who they're speaking with wants to leave immediately. I don't know anybody who wants to hang out and be interrogated by the police. And so that sort of uneasiness within that relationship makes it very difficult to for both sides to kind of stand down.
Well, as a citizen, uh, we'd like to think we educate ourselves in deciding who to vote for. We like to think we educate ourselves determining what laptop to buy or what car to buy. So educate yourselves on how to react with the police. Many agencies, I won't say many, some agencies offer what they call different names, citizens academies, where they invite you in for a day. They show you how the police work. They sort of explain things to you in this way to make a police literate citizenry is going to be get into a lot less trouble than people who make assumptions. Or if you don't want to do that, there are all kinds of videos online that are put out by reputable. And I will actually send you a couple of these when we're done. That basically explain this, just pretty much what I've explained, and it's comforting to know what you can do and what you can't. Because again, in some of these cases that I've reviewed, it's almost tragic. Again, when you're going over a police shooting case, you have the benefit of infinite hindsight. You're going over these things frame by frame. You're listening to witness accounts. None of this information may have been available to the police officer who is involved in this. But when you go through it, what you often see is that tipping point. That tipping point where you can really say, if the citizen had just done this instead of that, if the officer had just done that instead of this, then there wouldn't have been a grappling match. There wouldn't have been this. The guy wouldn't have, pulled out a tire iron, and the cop wouldn't have shot him. So that's where the training should emphasize. What can we do to maintain the law, do your job, but minimize the chance that you're going to have. And look, we've seen this all the time. We saw this in the recent case with the guy pulled from the car, and that was a perfect example. Police officer says, roll down your window. Why would you not do that? I understand you feel disrespected. There's a history there. Let's not be Pollyannas about this. We live in the real world. We live in a racially polarized world. That's often, almost always, a factor in a lot of these contested force cases. We have to deal with it. You can't fix something unless you know what's wrong. But common sense, you know what? Roll your window down. If you think the police officer did something inappropriate, make a note of it. File a complaint. Most police departments take complaints very seriously. No, I'm going to complain. They're not going to do anything about it. Yes, we've all heard exception stories, but most police agencies, they want to know what's going on because they want to know if this is a tip of that very iceberg we were talking about a moment ago. Is this some, person? Wait, this is the second time in a year there's been a citizen complaint. Now we have to investigate further. So be an educated citizen, give respect to get respect. And if you really believe that you've been wronged, take whatever legitimate action you can take. But is this the hill that's worth dying on? Is it worth getting yourself shot for? Just to make some kind of point. And that's especially the case if you're with your chucklehead friends who may be egging you on. So tell them to shut up, get out of there, and go back to work, go back to school, go back on your date, and get it over with.
That's just terrific information. I want to uh, switch topics for just a second because I know that you're an expert in this uh, in courtroom criminal responsibility that some think of as the insanity defense. I just want to ask a few questions about this topic, if that's okay.
Sure.
As lawyers, we learn in law school that every crime that you can be charged with has an associated mental state associated with it, and we call it mens rea, right? Which is the mental element,
Right.
and so in order to be found guilty, a prosecutor has to look and say, okay, what's the mens rea that I have to demonstrate for first degree murder? Premeditated, intentional act, and then you can kind of work your way down to reckless conduct, and even in the civil trial arena, we have to demonstrate that somebody failed to act reasonably under the circumstances, and you have to show a level of intent. Well, that intent element, even when a crime is, well, when an event occurs, then there's a victim. You still have to be able to establish within beyond a reasonable doubt the existence of the mental state. And so, can you provide our listeners with some insight into this idea of criminal responsibility, and uh, how somebody can actually, commit an event. We've got a trial going on right now up in Boulder, Colorado, right, where the King Soopers shooter, and his defense is not that he didn't do the act, but that he didn't have the mental culpability to have himself held criminally liable for the act. Can you provide some insight into this very fascinating
Yeah, I
area of
mean,
law?
based on what you just said, I tell my classes that criminal justice and psychology are like two twins that were separated at birth and reared apart, and found, when they're all grown up, that they're basically living on the same block. Because if you think about what you just said, if you shoot me, right, what's the charge going to be? The charge is going to be based on what the prosecutor imputes your motivation to be. If it was a complete accident, you were at a firing range and I stupidly ran across the target and got shot, then there's not going to be a charge. All right. If you were showing up on the wrong day for my Halloween party and I didn't know you were coming and you came into my house and I shot you there, that's going to be perhaps negligent homicide or something else. If you got me mad and you provoked me and to teach you a lesson, I shot you, then that's still homicide, but that might be second degree murder. And if I said, this was a terrible podcast, I'm really mad at that guy, he made me look bad, I'm going to wait for him to show up in the elevator and then I'm going to cap his behind, and I wait and premeditate and do it, that's murder one. Same act, but the charge is based on your presumed motivation. And that's the decision that the person making the charge has to undergo. But here's a pop quiz: in what percentage of cases does a criminal get off on an insanity defense?
Man, let me guess. Less than 1%, I'll say.
All right. Well, you're an attorney, so you're educated. So what most people don't realize is that it's only out of one in 100 cases that it's even raised. Out of that, it's another 1 in 100 that it's actually considered by the court. So by the time you get to it, yes, it's like one out of and then basically in most cases where an insanity charge is raised, the defendant is so obviously impaired that even the prosecution agrees that they're either legally insane or at least worthy of a lesser charge, and that's because it is very hard to prove insanity. But what does that mean? Now there are different standards of insanity. The most commonly used one in most states in the United States and places in Europe is the one that says, in order to be judged not guilty by reason of insanity, at the time the crime was committed, the person either has to literally not know what they were doing or not know that it was wrong. Now, not know that it was wrong means not just not know that it was against the law, but literally, not have the concept that it's wrong to kill a person. So if you think about the kinds of mental states that could make you that impaired, there are very few. Um, and remember, you mentioned about mens rea and actus rea. So in order to be convicted of a crime, it has to be proved that you actually committed the act, which is usually what most crimes are based on. Did the person do it or not? But when they say that you are not guilty by reason of insanity, look at the terminology. Not guilty. Not, all right, you're guilty, but there was an excuse. You're not guilty because if you could not form an intention to commit a crime, then there wasn't a you in there to commit that crime. Your body did it. It was almost like an automaton, but there was no way you could have intended it. So that's the standard. Now, you can have a mental illness or a mental disturbance and still be found guilty, but then you can use that mental disturbance, usually at sentencing, to argue for what's called diminished capacity. That yes, the person did inform the intention to commit the crime, but for various psychological reasons, the crime is less blameworthy because suffered from mental retardation, was unusually susceptible to peer influence, had autistic disorder, and so on. You're still guilty. It's not a not guilty trial, but you're likely to get lesser of a punishment where judges have discretion than if that mitigation warrant were imposed.
Well, there's something I think we should revisit because I think it's really an important. Some might call it a nuance, but it's much more than a nuance, and that is, I think that if you talk about somebody walking into a supermarket and opening fire and killing innocent people, for example, that the intuition is to say, of course the person is insane. Nobody who's not insane walks into a supermarket and shoots a bunch of people who they don't even know. But that's different than what you explained, which is it's the insanity defense is not based upon whether a normal person would walk in and commit the act. It's about whether the criminal actor knew, or I guess knew, or had the ability to know that what they were doing was wrong. Can you just go back on that again? Because you see what I'm saying?
Well,
Like,
you're raising all these great questions, and this is important. So this is the PowerPoint slide that I put up in my psychology and law class. The mere presence, absence, or severity of any mental disorder, condition, or state does not by itself make a legal determination. It is up to the jury, guided by whatever egghead forensic experts either side retains, to make that connection. So just because somebody was diagnosed with schizophrenia, just because somebody had a brain injury when they were 7 years old, just because somebody has had a diagnosis of epilepsy, doesn't mean that everything that they do has absolutely no volition whatsoever. There has to be some connection between that mental impairment and and at the time of the crime, that person's inability to form that mens rea that you mentioned earlier. And that is a very high bar to reach. It's not just everybody has a diagnosis. We all could be diagnosed with something. The legal question is, what is that relevance? And that is very difficult to prove. And that's where forensic experts have to roll up their sleeves and do their homework. So to get back to the mass shooters, in virtually no case would an expert say that they met the strict criteria for legal insanity. And there is a kind of pattern that you see in guys like this, almost always guys. I'm not sure. Most of the time, when women commit mass homicide, they commit it in circumstances that are much more covert. There may be people in medical facilities that give people overdoses, these sort of angels of death cases that occasionally pop up. But men, because they're men, tend to do things in a violent way, and in a gun-rich culture, it makes it very easy to do so. So there's typically they're not legally insane, but there is a kind of personality that tends to be somewhat inward-looking, paranoid, um, uh, perhaps mildly delusional. And there is also, now there are a lot of mildly delusional paranoid people, but they don't shoot people. There also has to be something in them that does have a kind of violent streak to them. Violence as a behavior is a transdiagnostic feature of some people's personalities. There are some people who are more prone to a violent reaction, either impulsively or premeditatively than other people. There are some people who just explode in a uncontrolled, violent way, and next thing you know, somebody's dead. But then there are people who are what's called the predatory type of violence, where it's a kind of cool, almost cold-blooded. It's like an animal stalking prey. If you look at this from a kind of naturalistic perspective, somebody pulling up to a supermarket, getting close enough, and then opening fire is not that different than a lion approaching a herd of zebras, getting close enough, and then picking out a target. It's a kind of expression of that sort of primitive hunting instinct that we all have. The difference is, for most of us, we have something called civilization that acts as a brake pedal. So I can be very mad at you, but I'm probably not going to kill you. Maybe because I'd like to believe, because I believe killing is wrong and we should settle our differences in a different way. But from a simply cold-blooded, self-interested perspective, is if I kill you, then I'm probably going to not have a normal life from that point on. So a lot of these guys have a combination of anger um, and sometimes a case of justification, but very often a case of sort of despondency and depression, because many of these individuals they're smart enough to know that there's a good chance they're not going to emerge from this alive, and a lot of times the kind of thought is sort of like, this is what people have done to me. I've been treated unfairly my whole life. In order for it not to be hanging out there, I've identified some group. It could be a racial group, an ethnic group, a religious group, a political group, and nobody wants to believe themselves to be bad. So I can tie it to some overarching philosophy. Maybe it's some political belief, and I feel like I'm saving the country or doing something like this. And then when I go in, it's basically all or nothing. And there are some people that are going to get a tremendous rush from the power imbued in being able to kill people. One thing that's different than has characterized human nature for all of history, for most of human history, it's been very hard for one person to kill another person. Think about it. Even with bows and arrows and bladed weapons, it takes some effort to kill you if I want to do so. If I have a firearm for only the last couple of 100 years, by the flick of a finger, I can cause someone's death. And for some people, fortunately not most people, fortunately a very small minority, otherwise we'd all be dead. For some people, that's a kind of inner intoxication they can't resist.
But the culpability in the criminal setting is not gauged by whether a normal or crazy person would act, but whether the actor themselves truly, scientifically, I suspect, right, is incapable of knowing that their actions are wrong. And I would venture to say that's a very, very, very small subset of people who could actually successfully make that argument.
Because if you think about most crimes that are committed, let's say not even mass homicide, but any kind of crime, bank robbers, anything like that. Typically, there's a lot of planning that goes into the crime, and then there are a lot of planning that goes into evading escape. Um, so if somebody doesn't know what they're doing, then why are they running away? Why are they trying to escape? Why are they doing that? So the answer is because they know what they're doing. Now they may have, even if they have a delusional belief for why they're doing it, that's not an issue for an insanity defense. If I believe that I should go shoot up a supermarket because God told me to do it, that's not the criteria for insanity. For insanity is I don't know what I'm doing. All right, I know what I'm doing. I may believe that God or the devil told me to do it, but in the eyes of the law, that's no different than if I told them to do it. All right. So that's the thing where people make the mistake. Look, I've had cases where people have tried to get out of an embezzlement case because they had epilepsy. They really did have epilepsy. They weren't making it up. But what does that have to do with, for years, cooking books? That takes a certain amount of skill and planning. That's not a mentally impaired individual. I had a bank robber who had hydrocephalus as a child. So look, people are grasping, and you have attorneys that will try to grasp for anything. But in most cases, this idea that it's almost like we want to believe that somebody who commits an atrocious act, and the two big ones up there are mass murderers and serial killers. All right, atrocious crimes that it's hard for most people to even get their minds around. Who would do something like this? You know what? We want to believe someone like that is insane. Because if we could believe that even a minimally sane person could do something like that, then, oh my God, you know, the same thing we were talking about earlier, then we're not safe. Because that
Right.
could, you always hear these cases when somebody is caught, like a serial killer. It's, oh, gee, I don't get it. I worked beside this guy all along, or workplace shooter incidents. It seemed like a sort of a, not too friendly guy, kept to himself, but, came in, did his job, said hello, had lunch. And the news love that, because that's, they love anything that's going to get you to watch their show so they can sell their commercials. But that heightens the public's danger. The irony is, and this is sort of what I'll leave you with, is with all the talk of, when a dog, they don't say when a dog bites a man, that's not news. When a man bites a dog, that's what gets on the news. So we make a big deal of these things because they are the exceptions. And if you read authors like Steven Pinker, we have to realize that the reason we're even talking about this is we do live, those of us who live in Western societies, you can't say that about everywhere in the world, but we do live in the safest environment we've ever lived in human history, health-wise, crime-wise, in every other respect. I'm not being Pollyannish. I'm not, being naive about it. But before we get into a panic that paralyzes us as citizens, we have to realize, we go out there and we do things on an everyday basis. And for most of human history, most people woke up every morning without the guarantee that they weren't going to be dead by nightfall, by an illness, by a plague, by a flood, by killed by a robber. And the fact that most of us get up every morning taking it for granted that we're going to go to sleep in our bed that night, that's something that's unusual from the perspective of history. So let's enjoy it, at least while we can.
That's exciting. It's really fabulous, man. Our time is up for the hour. I just can't thank you enough. Just fascinating stuff, and even just the information you've been able to impart uh, to our audience is fabulous. So thank
Well, thank
you
you for
so
asking the
much.
right questions.
Yeah, well, was looking so forward to this opportunity to talk with you. And if people want to learn more about you, what's the best way for them to find you?
Just look up Laurence Miller, PhD, online, and you'll. I can run, but I can't hide. You'll find me.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Miller, for being here. Really appreciate it. Again, to the audience, thank you so much for listening. I hope that you have learned something today. I know you have learned something today. And be safe out there, and we'll see you next time.
You've been tuning into the Unthinkable podcast with your host, Kyle Bachus. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, kylebachus.com. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.